74,000 years ago, the Earth convulsed. In what is now Sumatra, Indonesia, a supervolcano called Toba tore open the planet's crust and unleashed one of the most violent eruptions in the last 25 million years. Within days, a blanket of ash several meters thick buried vast regions of Southeast Asia. Within weeks, global temperatures began their catastrophic plunge. Within years, the human population, our ancestors, had crashed from hundreds of thousands to perhaps just 1,000 breeding pairs. This is the story of how a single volcanic eruption nearly erased humanity from existence, leaving only the most resourceful fragments of our species to carry forward the genetic legacy we all share today. Before Toba erupted, Earth hosted its greatest experiment in human diversity. This wasn't the singular human world we know today. Multiple species of humans occupied different corners of the planet, each adapted to its particular environment through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. In the frozen landscapes of Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals thrived as the apex predators of the Ice Age. These robust, powerful hunters had evolved thick bones and muscular builds perfectly suited to wrestling down massive prey in sub-zero temperatures. Their sophisticated toolkits and burial practices revealed a culture as complex as any early Homo sapiens group. Across Asia, the enigmatic Denisovans ranged from Siberia to Southeast Asia, known to us primarily through DNA that tells of widespread successful populations. Even more mysterious groups persisted: Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. Our own species, Homo sapiens, had existed in Africa for over 200,000 years, but remained largely confined to that continent. Perhaps several 100,000 individuals lived in small, mobile bands of 25 to 50 people, connected through complex kinship networks. They had mastered diverse African environments using Middle Stone Age technology that included specialized hunting tools and sophisticated processing techniques. Small groups had ventured into the Middle East around 100,000 years ago, but these early expansions failed to establish permanent populations outside Africa. The global climate was sliding into marine isotope stage 4, a cooling phase heading toward extensive glaciation. Megafauna dominated every continent: mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses in the north, giant ground sloths in the Americas, and the ancestors of modern African wildlife throughout our species' homeland. On the island of Sumatra, pressure had been building beneath the Earth's surface for millennia. The Indo-Australian tectonic plate grounds beneath the Eurasian plate at this volatile junction, creating a massive magma chamber that has erupted catastrophically several times before. The previous major eruption occurred 840,000 years ago, but the chamber had been steadily refilling, pressurizing, and preparing. Surface life continued unaware. Tropical forests teemed with biodiversity. Early humans in the region hunted and gathered in a landscape that showed no obvious signs of the cataclysm building beneath their feet. The Indian subcontinent hosted its own populations, using stone tool technologies that archaeologists would later find preserved in perfect stratigraphic sequences. This was humanity at its most diverse, its most distributed, its most experimental. Multiple solutions to the problem of being human coexisted across the planet. Each species represented millions of years of evolutionary refinement, successful adaptations to its specific niches. Within the span of a single day, this rich tapestry would begin its violent unraveling. The eruption began with massive earthquakes felt across Southeast Asia. The ground above the magma chamber fractured along a line that would eventually stretch 100 kilometers. Then the Earth opened. The Volcanic Explosivity Index measures eruptions on a logarithmic scale from 0 to 8. Mount St. Helens in 1980 registered as VEI 5. Krakatoa's 1883 eruption, which killed 36,000 people and was heard 3,000 miles away, was VEY 6. Mount Pinatubo in 1991, which cooled global temperatures by half a degree Celsius for 2 years, also ranked as VEI 6. Toba was a VEI 8. A mega-colossal event, at least 100 times more powerful than Pinatubo. The supervolcano ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To comprehend this volume, consider that it could bury the entire state of Texas under 5 feet of ash. The eruption column punched through the troposphere and deep into the stratosphere, reaching heights of 40 kilometers, more than twice the cruising altitude of commercial aircraft. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and volcanic matter, raced outward at speeds exceeding 700 kilometers per hour. These flows maintained temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt copper. Everything within 500 kilometers was instantly annihilated. Forests were vaporized, not burned. Animals were reduced to shadows in the ash, their organic matter instantly carbonized. The ashfall began immediately and continued for weeks. Sumatra itself was buried under deposits reaching 600 meters thick near the caldera. India, 3,000 kilometers away, was covered by ash deposits averaging 15 centimeters, with some areas receiving up to 6 meters. This ash wasn't like snow that could be brushed aside. It was composed of microscopic glass shards that lacerated lung tissue when inhaled, became concrete-like when mixed with water, and contained fluorine compounds that poisoned water sources. The eruption's acoustic shockwaves circled the globe multiple times. The sound near the source was beyond human comprehension, not a boom, but a physical force that liquefied internal organs through acoustic trauma. Regional devastation was absolute. The ash destroyed all vegetation across millions of square kilometers. It clogged rivers, creating massive mudflows that reshaped entire drainage systems. Marine ecosystems throughout the Indian Ocean were devastated as ash turned the ocean surface into thick gray sludge that blocked sunlight from reaching phytoplankton. The eruption lasted approximately 2 weeks of continuous explosive activity. By its end, it had created a caldera 100 kilometers long and 35 kilometers wide, a wound in the earth that exists today as Lake Toba. But the regional catastrophe was only the beginning. The true global disaster was just starting to unfold in the stratosphere, where 10 billion tons of sulfur dioxide had begun its transformation into a planetary shroud. The sulfur dioxide rose into the stratosphere, that stable atmospheric layer between 10 and 50 kilometers above Earth's surface. Here, above the weather, above the cleansing effect of rain, the gas began a chemical transformation that would affect every living thing on the planet. Sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols, microscopic droplets between 0.1 and 1 micrometer in diameter. These droplets were the perfect size to scatter incoming solar radiation. Too small to fall out quickly, too numerous to ignore, they formed a veil that would persist for years. The aerosol layer spread with stratospheric winds, reaching global coverage within 3 weeks. Incoming shortwave solar radiation encountered the aerosol layer and was scattered. Approximately 10% of the sun's energy was reflected to space before it could warm the Earth's surface. The planet's energy budget, stable for millennia, suddenly shifted into deficit. Surface temperatures began dropping within days of the eruption. Ice core data from Greenland shows sulfate concentrations spiked to levels 10 times higher than background immediately after Toba. Antarctic cores reveal the same signal, confirming global distribution. These ice cores also preserve the temperature signal, oxygen isotope ratios, indicating the most severe cold snap of the last 100,000 years. Global average temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius within the first year. Regional variations were extreme. Tropical regions experienced the smallest drops, though even a 3-degree cooling in the tropics was catastrophic for ecosystems adapted to stable temperatures. Mid-latitude regions saw drops of 8 to 10 degrees. Northern Europe and Asia experienced the most severe cooling, up to 15 degrees Celsius below pre-eruption levels. To understand what a 15-degree drop means, consider that the difference between today's climate and the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe, was only about 6 degrees. Toba created conditions more than twice as severe, and it did so not over millennia, but in months. The sulfuric acid didn't just block sunlight. It fell as acid rain with a pH as low as 2, more acidic than lemon juice. This rain sterilized soils, killing microbial communities essential for nutrient cycling. It leached heavy metals from rocks and sediments, creating toxic runoff that poisoned streams and lakes. Ocean surfaces absorbed sulfuric acid, lowering pH levels and disrupting the calcium carbonate chemistry that marine organisms needed to build shells. The Asian monsoon, which billions of organisms depended on for seasonal rainfall, failed. Without the temperature differential between land and ocean that drives monsoonal circulation, the rains simply stopped. The aerosols also catalyzed ozone destruction, with the ozone layer thinning by an estimated 20 to 30%, allowing harmful UV radiation to reach the surface. This wasn't a single disaster, but a cascade of interconnected catastrophes, each amplifying the others. Stanley Ambrose, an anthropologist at the University of Illinois, first connected the Toba eruption to human near extinction in 1998. His theory emerged from a puzzling fact about human genetics. For a species of nearly 8 billion individuals spread across every continent, we are remarkably, almost impossibly, similar to one another. Chimpanzees, confined to small regions of Africa with populations measured in hundreds of thousands, display more genetic diversity than all humans combined. This uniformity in human DNA suggested our ancestors had passed through an extreme genetic bottleneck, a period when the breeding population shrank so dramatically that only a tiny fraction of our genetic diversity survived. Geneticists studying mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through the mother's line, found that all living humans descend from a remarkably small number of maternal lineages. The mutation rate in mitochondrial DNA acts as a molecular clock, allowing scientists to estimate when these lineages converged. The calculations pointed to a bottleneck between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Y chromosome analysis told the same story from the paternal side. The diversity was so low, it suggested that at some point, the entire human species descended from perhaps just a few dozen surviving males. The timing aligned perfectly with Toba. Mathematical models based on genetic diversity suggested the human population crashed from several 100,000 individuals to between 3,000 and 10,000 survivors worldwide. The most extreme calculations proposed as few as 1,000 breeding pairs, perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 individuals total. This represents a population reduction of up to 99%. The mechanism of death would have been gradual but relentless. Plants died first, forests stripped bare by acid rain, grasslands buried under ash, photosynthesis rates dropping by up to 90% in the reduced sunlight. Herbivores died next. Large mammals like elephants, which needed hundreds of pounds of vegetation daily, starved within weeks. Carnivores followed as prey populations crashed. Humans faced the same pressures. Hunting became impossible when there was no game. Gathering failed when there were no plants. Freshwater sources became death traps. Ash and acid rain had turned rivers into toxic slurries of sulfuric acid and fluorine. Disease followed malnutrition as weakened immune systems fell prey to infections. Some groups simply disappeared entirely. Each extinction was not just a personal tragedy, but the loss of thousands of generations of accumulated knowledge and genetic diversity. The initial volcanic winter lasted 6 to 10 years of continuous freeze. Summers failed during this period. In regions that normally experienced warm growing seasons, July temperatures remained below freezing. Snow that fell in October didn't melt the following August. After the first decade, stratospheric aerosols began settling out, and temperatures started recovering. But the eruption had triggered feedback mechanisms that would persist for centuries. Ice sheets reflected sunlight. Dead vegetation released stored carbon as it decomposed, but there were no living plants to recapture it. Ocean circulation patterns, disrupted by sudden cooling, took decades to re-establish. Full climate recovery requires up to 1,000 years. Ice core records show that the millennium following Toba was the coldest of the last 100,000 years. This wasn't just one bad decade followed by normalcy, it was centuries of a fundamentally altered planet. Ecosystems didn't simply bounce back when temperatures rose. Volcanic ash, while containing some nutrients, lacks the organic matter and microbial communities that make soil fertile. Pioneer species, specialized mosses and ferns adapted to volcanic substrates, had to colonize first. Only after these pioneers had lived, died, and decomposed for generations could more complex plants establish themselves. Animal populations recovered even more slowly. Large mammals with long generation times and low reproductive rates took centuries to rebuild viable populations. Starting from handfuls of survivors, it would take 500 years for populations to recover to even modest numbers. Genetic diversity, once lost, never fully recovered. The survivors carried only a fraction of their species' original genetic variation. Cultural knowledge accumulated over millennia could vanish in a single generation if there were no survivors to pass it on. Language diversity collapsed along with populations. The survivors didn't merely endure, they transformed. Archaeological sites that preserve evidence from the Toba period reveal not cultural collapse, but rapid innovation under extreme pressure. Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa provides the clearest window into human survival during the catastrophe. The caves show continuous occupation before, during, and after the Toba eruption. During the worst of the volcanic winter, the inhabitants shifted their subsistence strategy dramatically. With terrestrial resources devastated, they turned to the sea. The inhabitants weren't just occasionally collecting shellfish. They were systematically harvesting marine resources on a scale that suggests it had become their primary food source. They developed scheduled gathering strategies, timed to lunar cycles and tidal patterns. Stone tools show evidence of hafting, attaching stone blades to wooden handles, creating specialized implements for processing marine resources. The use of ochre, a red iron oxide pigment, intensified dramatically. Ochre served no practical survival purpose, suggesting symbolic behavior that helped maintain cohesion during extreme stress. Heat-treated stone tools appear with increasing frequency. The inhabitants had discovered that slowly heating certain stones in controlled fires changed the stone's crystalline structure, making it easier to work and producing sharper edges. This technique required planning, patience, and precise temperature control. Microlithic technology, the production of tiny, standardized stone blades, developed during this period. These microliths could be mounted in series along wooden or bone shafts, creating composite tools. This represented a conceptual leap from single-component to multi-component technology. Survival through a decade-long volcanic winter required unprecedented cooperation extending beyond immediate family. Long-distance exchange networks emerged, with materials sourced from hundreds of kilometers away appearing at sites, suggesting information sharing about resources and survival strategies. The cognitive demands of survival are selected for enhanced working memory, planning depth, and behavioral flexibility. These traits, once rare variants, became concentrated in the surviving population. The genetic evidence is unequivocal. Modern humans carry the signature of a severe population bottleneck in our DNA. Every person alive today descends from the tiny fraction of humanity that survived Toba, whether the survival rate was 1% or slightly higher. Critics of the full catastrophe scenario point to contradictory evidence. The Jwalapuram site in southern India preserves stone tools in layers both below and above the Toba ash. The tools are virtually identical in their production techniques, suggesting that local populations survived even under meters of ash and continued their cultural traditions without interruption. Michael Petraglia, who excavated Jwalapuram, argues for a more modest impact. Some recent climate models suggest that while northern hemisphere cooling was severe, tropical Africa experienced a more moderate temperature drop of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. This would have caused hardship, but not necessarily 99% mortality. The genetic bottleneck itself has alternative explanations. The out-of-Africa migration that successfully populated the rest of the world occurred 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, shortly after Toba. The bottleneck signature might come from this migration, rather than the eruption itself. Yet even if the death toll was only 90% rather than 99%, the implications remain staggering. The traits that allowed some humans to survive while others perished would have been dramatically concentrated in the remaining population. These traits, enhanced cooperation, innovative thinking, behavioral flexibility, long-term planning, became the foundation of modern human behavior. The first unambiguous evidence of modern human behavior, complex art, elaborate burials, sophisticated multi-component tools, explodes across the archaeological record after 70,000 years ago. Humans who had been confined to Africa for over 100,000 years suddenly developed the capacity to colonize every environment on Earth. The survivors weren't randomly selected, they were filtered by the most extreme conditions our species had ever faced. Those who emerged weren't average representatives of their species. They were extreme survivors, carrying concentrated doses of the traits that would eventually enable their descendants to build civilizations. Neanderthals and Denisovans faced the same global catastrophe. Their populations, already smaller than African Homo sapiens, may never have fully recovered. When modern humans expanded out of Africa, they encountered cousin species weakened by the same event that had honed Homo sapiens into something new. Today, 8 billion humans inhabit every corner of Earth. The genetic uniformity that reveals our near extinction has become the foundation for a species that achieved unprecedented dominance. Every human trait we celebrate was shaped by ancestors who survived Earth's darkest winter, whether the bottleneck reduced our population by 90% or 99%, whether caused solely by Toba or multiple factors. The genetic evidence confirms our ancestors passed through an evolutionary keyhole that fundamentally shaped what we became. We are the children of catastrophe, descended from the 1% who refused to go extinct. Every time you cooperate with a stranger, innovate a solution, or persist through seeming impossibility, you're expressing traits that were refined in the crucible of near extinction. The supervolcano that almost ended our story instead wrote its most defining chapter, transforming a vulnerable African ape into the only species capable of understanding its own origins. Toba didn't just fail to destroy us, it created us.